Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another one of our In Conversation with Lawyers series. And today I'm really delighted that we've got Flora Curtis with us, who is a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers and who really focuses and concentrates on complex environmental matters and deals with high-profile climate change litigation. Flora, thanks very much for doing this with us.
Thanks, David. Thanks for inviting me to speak to your students today.
Okay. Why don't we just start by saying what really led in your background to becoming a barrister or doing this sort of work? You did a master's degree in history at Cambridge, I know, and then rapidly moved into the bar. So give the audience a feel for what it was that predicated this sort of route in your background, if you can.
Yeah, so you're right that I came to the law probably via quite a circuitous route, not directly through doing a law degree. I did a history degree, and you're right, I did a MPhil in early modern history at Cambridge. And I think when I was doing that, I kind of decided that I didn't want to pursue a career in academia, but I did want to go into a profession that combined quite intellectually challenging work with also engagement with more present day issues. So that was the reason why I initially went on to do the conversion course and go into the legal profession. And I think in terms of going into the bar, it was partly just through gaining experience in both sides of the profession, the solicitor and barrister route. I think I was more drawn to um, the um, the some of the kind of a strong emphasis on legal research and figuring out difficult, knotty issues that you get doing advisory work at the bar. And also, I really enjoyed the advocacy experience that I had when I did mooting and things like that. So that was kind of what decided it for me.
Just in terms of personal resilience, the bar is not the easiest profession to navigate or engage with successfully. Were you ever sort of put off by the sort of messages that people get in terms of the difficulty of the bar? How did you feel you were ready to take on that bigger challenge? Or was it a case of naivety carrying you forward productively?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was probably more the latter for me, to be honest. I think it was the kind of almost hubristic sense that I'd done a lot of challenging things. So, it was just one more challenge to add to the list. I think I was probably quite surprised the first time I applied for pupillage, just how challenging it really was in terms of getting interviews and progressing through those interviews. But I think when I was going through that process, I was kind of of the attitude that if I had a setback, then it was just another incentive to try harder next time. So, um, yeah, I think nowadays I'm probably I look back on the process thinking that was a pretty exhausting process. But I think at the time you just kind of have the enthusiasm to get you through all of that.
That's good. Thanks for that. How about choosing your area of practice in which to specialize? Where did that come from, do you think?
I think for me, when I was studying the law, and I obviously only had a relatively short amount of time to do so because I did the conversion course, and you do most of your learning and studying and basically concentrated into 9 months. But I knew I had an interest in public law because it's quite I suppose, quite a political area of the law. Um, in terms of going into environmental law, I think it partly came through that because I did my pupillage and my training at a set that had a very heavy focus in planning law. And in terms of public law in practice, planning law is one of those areas that gives rise to a lot of judicial review challenges, a lot of statutory review challenges. So there's a lot of opportunity to do that kind of work if you go to the planning bar. And then within that, I think I was drawn to the environmental side of the planning bar because I mean, environmental issues have become far more prominent in political discourse, and in particular, some of the more pressing environmental challenges posed by issues such as climate change. It makes it a really fascinating and interesting area to work in, and also quite interesting in terms of as somebody who did a history degree and then studied the law. There's quite a lot of science and scientific information and technical information that you get involved with and get to grips with as a barrister working in kind of planning and environmental law, which is quite interesting for me in terms of learning new things and trying to get my head around new areas of expertise.
You've explained that very well. It sounds like a very happy choice in the end. And you've touched on it as well already, but in terms of your typical activities, what you haven't yet mentioned, is there something you'd highlight as something that you, as a practitioner, you do a lot of, or is there something that's looked on as a highlight? What would you sort of let the audience know about in terms of a day's activities, certainly an attractive day's activities?
I think, yeah, I mean, in terms of there's not necessarily a typical day as a environmental barrister. I think it's probably not a typical day as a barrister working in any specialism at the bar, because often, you're dealing with new challenges on a day-to-day basis. For me, I think I really enjoy working on judicial and statutory reviews, and getting to go to the High Court to do that type of work. Often those cases, they run on for quite a long time, which gives you an opportunity to get into the issues in quite a lot of depth. And it's also a style of advocacy, I think, which is slightly different to if you're doing, for example, a trial and you'll be doing a lot of witness handling, whereas judicial review advocacy is much more, you don't generally have witness handling or people giving evidence doing those types of hearings. It's more long form making of submissions, and seeking to persuade the court that way, which I find really, really fun and interesting.
That was really insightful. Thanks for that. And you've touched on the growth in politicization in the background of the work. Just give the audience an idea of what will be driving practice in the next 5 years. What is it to sort of keep an eye on, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's it's a really good question. I think certainly, as you've mentioned, those kind of boundaries between politics and the law are certainly something that have been very prominent in environmental practice and will likely continue to be very prominent in the coming years. I mean, obviously, we're recording this in September 2024. We've relatively recently had a new government that's come into place, and that always brings up its challenges in terms of how is the government going to put in place its ambitions while also working within the longer term legal frameworks that already exist. I mean, with this government, I'm sure there will probably be tensions in the types of practice areas I work in between, for example, the ambition to deliver huge increases in the levels of housing, and also the instinct to ensure that the environment is protected. Um, Anyone who works in planning will know that there's often a lot of debate when new developments are seeking permission as to the environmental impact of that development. And often that can stop a development in its tracks before any construction has even begun. So it'll be interesting to see how this government deals with that while also trying to ensure that things such as biodiversity net gain, general biodiversity improvements, are also prioritised. I think, other potential difficulties, relatively recent court cases have made quite clear that the obligations that are placed on governments by statutes such as the Climate Change Act 2008 are much stronger than perhaps had previously been appreciated. In the past few years, two of the government's overarching plans for the delivery of necessary emissions reductions have essentially been held to be unlawful by the courts. And so there'll be questions and challenges for this new government in terms of how are they able to meet their legal obligations and also obligations under international law, without effectively making themselves highly unpopular politically by imposing unpopular policies such as things related to boilers in people's homes, the types of cars that people are able to use. And you see that also outside the climate change arena with air quality policies like ULEZ that were highly unpopular for example, the Mayor of London prior to the mayoral elections this year. So I think, that kind of balance between trying to achieve legal commitments while also doing so in a politically palatable way will continue to be challenging. I think a final one that I'd just throw in there, we've obviously had a huge increase in discussions around climate change and the challenges posed by climate change. I think another one that's becoming increasingly at the forefront of people's minds is this question of nature depletion and biodiversity loss. the UK reportedly being one of the most biodiversity depleted countries in the world. That would be another one to follow, I think, and possibly interesting in terms of, are there interactions or difficulties between how we go about delivering on climate change commitments while also respecting nature, and what kind of interaction will there be between the need for large scale renewable energy infrastructure and maintaining biodiversity. But yeah, I think those are the three that I would point to over the next few years.
That was very helpful, grounding us in some of the real detail there. I think it makes things very tangible for the audience to hear. So thanks very much for that. Just a final question on this section. What advice would you have for students now who are interested in environmental law generally, or the bar end of the profession? What advice would you be proffering at the minute for that group?
Hmm. I think, I mean, there's a lot of resources out there which go over a lot of the kind of core things that people can get involved in if they want to go into the bar. So I won't rehearse all of those. But I think, in this particular specialism, there are increasingly opportunities, I think, for students to get involved in conversations about environmental law with professionals, um, including a group that I am involved in myself. I'm one of the deputy chairs of a group called Legal Voices for the Future, and that's what we're intended to do is be a collaborative learning forum whereby young lawyers, including young practitioners, people in early stages of their career, but also students who are interested in environmental law, paralegals, other people who are not yet qualified, can share ideas and information about the ways in which the climate and biodiversity crises can touch on the legal profession and the type of work that we do. One way that we try to facilitate that is by holding monthly knowledge sessions, which are free to attend and open to anyone to attend. We have them both in person, and they're generally in London, or people are able to also attend online. And they are on topics such as the international wildlife trade, climate science and litigation, ESG, strategic climate litigation, topics like that. So sort of interesting topics that are becoming increasingly discussed, I suppose, in the environmental and climate space. We have a lot of recordings on YouTube of previous sessions if anyone's interested in those. But yeah, I mean, attending things like that are both a useful way to be able to get some contacts within the profession, people who are working there already, but also to get on top of information about issues that are hot topics in environmental law. We put out most of our information on LinkedIn. So as I said, if anyone would like to attend, they'd be very welcome to do so.
That's super helpful. Thanks for being so detailed with that list. It's often difficult to unearth that sort of high value activity, and so you've made it very easy there for a student to engage. I just wanted to ask you a couple of broader questions, if I can, alongside the ones about your practice area. How do you think generally you've talked well there about tapping into these informational resources, but how should students think about developing an effective, a strong profile in making applications for the bar? What will help them stand out? What is it that the profession particularly values in an applicant?
That's a really good question. And I think certainly my experience of going through the recruitment process was that sometimes there's not necessarily a uniform answer because different chambers might be looking for different things or different qualities in people. But I mean, I think, to be honest, part of the advice that I would give for people looking to join the bar is sometimes maybe to focus less on looking at the thing that will cause you to stand out in the sense of having a particularly interesting thing on your CV, and more on spending a lot of time really dedicated to doing the basics, I suppose, really well. Because I mean, certainly some people I know and some people that I was looking at their CVs online when I was applying for pupillage, you have people who stand out because they have already had outstanding early careers in other areas, people who have done academia or worked in politics or policy or some sort of other area, and then they come to the bar. And sometimes I think it can feel quite intimidating to look at those and think, how am I ever going to compete with people like that? But I think often when I'm certainly looking at people's CVs, with the disclaimer that I'm not currently involved in pupillage recruitment, but I've been involved in sort of reviewing people's applications before and giving advice on how to improve them. The most important thing that people can do is just make sure that you're doing the basics, as I said, really well. So your pupillage form and the interviews that you do are really an opportunity to demonstrate your advocacy skills and to sell yourself to a chambers. So make sure that you put into practice, when you're doing those forms, all of the skills that you might bring, for example, to a mooting competition or to essay writing, and just use those to craft your answers to questions in the forms really well and really effectively. Just write well, write concisely, review your form as a whole, as you would do with a piece of writing that you're doing, and make sure that you haven't got any typos. I think also, with applicants coming from university like Cambridge, it's also important to make sure that while you're at Cambridge, you're taking advantage of all the opportunities that are available to you while you're there, because once you're out of university, sometimes it can be more difficult to find opportunities to do things such as mooting, or participation in societies that might be helpful to put on your application form, because if you don't have those kind of more basic boxes ticked on your form, the person reading your application might look at it and think, why didn't that person do X, Y, and Z if they are so interested in becoming a barrister? So
Sure.
possibly not an answer to the question that you specifically asked, but I think, yeah, I would say focus less on finding a shiny thing that will make you different to every other applicant, because inevitably lots of the applicants for pupillage have quite similar backgrounds. Just make sure that you're taking that information and selling yourself really well.
Good. No, that is very helpful. Back to basics is always a good message and
Mm.
is easily overlooked. So thanks for that. Final question from me, and a very unfair one. Pupillage interview tips. That you've already alluded to just how challenging pupillage interviews can be, especially if, one after another, quick repetition, different chambers looking for different things. What helped you, or perhaps what have you seen that works really, really well that the audience can take away in terms of pupillage interview tips?
I think probably I would say don't necessarily do what I did and apply to so many different places that you have so many interviews that you can't really dedicate the time to each place that it probably deserves. Um, but yeah, I mean, tips for interviews. I think sometimes it can be a bit difficult to navigate chambers' websites as an applicant for pupillage, because they're inevitably designed to sell the chambers to clients rather than necessarily to pupillage applicants. So often those websites will list, the chambers as a specialist in all of these different practice areas, which actually aren't necessarily the core bread and butter day-to-day work that members of chambers are doing. So that's one thing that I would advise people to do, is really make sure you have an understanding by probably going on chambers news websites and looking at the types of publications and groups that members are involved in, gain an understanding of what actually is the type of work that this set of chambers does. It's good if you have concrete examples there of, if you're asked in an interview, what's a case that we've done that you've been really interested in? If you have cases that you've actually read and you're able to discuss and engage with speakers, which I think also, as I said, plays back into the not overloading yourself and trying to go for quality over necessarily targeting every single chamber that you think you might necessarily be interested in. I think also with interviews, just generally treating it not like a formal advocacy exercise in the sense of a moot, but remembering that that's the only opportunity that the interview panel will have to see you speaking out loud. And that is obviously one of the most important skills that you will need as a barrister. So if you are asked to do some sort of exercise where you are trying to argue a point, almost doing it in a similar way as you would do an advocacy exercise, and keeping your answers structured, focusing on the most important points. And if you're challenged by the panel on a particular point, which they will obviously do, don't necessarily give in at the first sign of challenge, because if you're a barrister representing your client in court, your client's not necessarily going to thank you if you do that immediately.
That's a great point on which to leave it. So thanks very much for that, Laura. And thanks indeed for doing the whole interview with us this afternoon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much.